I'm writing this up hoping this is going to be a shorter video, so let's see how this turns out. Let me preface this by saying I am not a psychologist, or a therapist, or a brain doctor of any kind. I also do not think Mr. Oda is any of these things either. I think his writing is just very good in terms of explaining why characters do the things they do. So when I explain the trauma I see written, or discuss the effects I see in these characters, this does not come from a professional place. This comes from a personal experience place. As someone with my own life problems and struggles I've had to face through my own anxieties. I'm saying this because if you're someone who connects deeply to a character I bring up and you feel I may have mishandled them or Oda himself has mishandled them, do let me know. I am only but one person. As always, I will tread as respectfully as possible, but observation is no replacement for personal experience. Remember everyone, we don't listen to respond. We listen to listen. In saying that, the reason I thought about this topic and the reason I decided on it is because One Piece truly surprised me in the presentation of its characters. I'm sure you all know by now how obsessed I am with these characters, and I'm especially obsessed with how they're consistently good. One Piece is one of the first shows I've ever encountered where I genuinely struggle to find a character I hate. And I don't mean hate as in the Doflamingo hate, where I say I hate him, but what I really mean is he fascinates me so much I cannot stand him. No, I mean hate as in I personally cannot stand the sight of that damn character. A character that makes me point at them and go ew and grab my stomach and throw up because I want to hurl them into the damn sun, which is not meant to be the intended reaction to said character, or a character who annoys me to hell and back. A character I cannot stand to see on the screen because I think they're arse, even though, again, it's not meant to be the intended reaction for the character. I know it's different for everyone, and to each their own. Perception of a character doesn't just come down to the writing sometimes. Outside forces can also affect this in negative ways, such as a bad fandom experience or even similarities between a character and a real-world person one may know that is hard to shake off. Or it just comes down to media illiteracy and misunderstanding a character's writing entirely, but who said that? Who said that? It wasn't me. Anyways, my point is I do not have characters I hate in One Piece. I have characters I dislike in terms of personal problems, but I still like their character. I flip tables for good reasons, not bad reasons, when reading this series. Because One Piece has done this spectacular thing for me where I don't get frustrated at who I see and the actions they're engaging in. Or if I do get frustrated, I know why things are happening. But even more spectacular than that, if I get frustrated at a character and there is no explanation, I know we will get an explanation. Because that's the secret sauce Oda dunks into his writing to make it so enjoyable. And it's the drug he laces into each individual character to make sure at least one of them will be relatable to just about anyone. He gives them flaws. But he doesn't just give them flaws, he gives us a reasoning for these flaws. Whoa. I say this like it's some amazing thing, because as I've said in a few videos before, what Oda does is writing 101. There's no, revolutionary idea to having a cause and effect to a character's behavior, because yeah, I sure hope there is. That's a pretty basic standard. But here's the thing about One Piece. Oda takes the basics and he just does them really fucking well. Because he doesn't just give his characters reasoning, he gives them layers upon layers upon layers of reasoning. To the point where every single individual action and decision of a character can be traced right back to their origins for why they are doing that thing. And can even be looked at under a microscope and can even be looked at under a microscope for foreshadowing purposes too. I will not be getting into them now, but a huge example of this is both Crocodile and Mihawk. Crocodile and Mihawk both do not have a backstory as of yet. but their behaviors are indicating more than ever they will sure as hell be getting one. Crocodile and Mihawk both turn their backs on the world. One of them prefers being alone, while the other tries to build a utopia for himself. And as Crocodile said to Mihawk, you and I are the same. We don't trust anyone. And those qualities have been shown before Crocodile ever said it, with Crocodile keeping himself as an anonymous figurehead for years while also wanting to kill Whitebeard. And with Mihawk, he's so distant from everyone that he literally sails around on his own in a coffin boat, putting the dark, damp castle and family of apes aside. It's a very purposeful thing Oda does here, because what he likes doing is giving us the ending before the beginning. So for characters like Crocodile and Mihawk, we are shown their outcomes before their origins. And their outcomes are obviously a result of whatever events they have been through. Hence why everyone in One Piece gets a backstory. It's not just because Oda can't help himself and is trying to pad out his story by unnecessary means. Because none of this is unnecessary, and I will always argue that as the case. Everyone gets a backstory because we are encouraged to ask for it. Because we are seeing these broken people, and we're waiting to be turned on our heads for how someone can turn out in such a way. He's hoping this ages well and Crocodile and Mihawk get their backstory in the next 10 years so I can say I told you so. The thing is, when we are presented with these stories, when a character is finally shown with every corner of their life exposed to us, this isn't just for us to pity them. There is pity in it, that's undeniable, but it's also for us to understand them and sympathize with them. It's especially magnificent in teaching us how trauma can shape a person, for the worse or for the better, particularly when we consider everything a character goes through is not their fault, because a majority of the time they are children. And usually when a character is shaped for the worse, that isn't their fault either. It tends to be a result of negligence and exploitation of the character's life or the system around them that works to ruin them. Hence why I really enjoy a lot of the villains in One Piece, because tons of these villains have a trauma of their own, but they don't tend to just be bad people, because bad people do not suddenly happen the second a child goes through a traumatic event. That's an incredibly dangerous thing to think, and that's not what this series encourages at all. Most villains in One Piece are formed due to the fact they went through distressing life events that definitely altered their brain chemistry, but they had no healthy support to help process such events. No help came in the form of family or system interjection, and instead these villains are molded around an outside force taking advantage of them and their damaged selves. Two examples of this: Big Mom and Kaido. Doflamingo is also there, but he is a whole different thing. There's so much more happening with him, but I can't get to him in this video because it's just too long and I can't talk about him. Just watch my Doflamingo video and make it up for yourselves. Big Mom and Kaido were both children abandoned by the people around them, and were both seen as powerful children who could be used. Kaido faces the traumas of early independence and war, and Big Mom faces the traumas of abandonment. Insanely interesting, considering both of these traumas are things some of the Straw Hats have similarly gone through. Not to the same extent, of course, but there are parallels. Big Mom and Kaido's stories do make you feel sorry for them, and it's not just because of the pain they've gone through. It's because we're seeing how a cruel world can create cruel people, especially in a world that lacks genuine love and care. And this is so important when comparing these villains to our so-called good characters, such as the Straw Hats or other friends they make along the way. I myself struggle to call them good and bad characters because Oda has made a very intentional choice to not include the black and white concept of just good and bad people. This is very prominent in Fishman Island, when the crowd asks if Luffy and his crew are friends or foes. Luffy shouts that the crowd can decide for themselves whose side they're on. Because more than good or bad people, One Piece values good and bad actions specifically, especially with how the systems that be in this world use their power. There are no good or bad monarchies in One Piece. There are only good or bad actions from the people running these monarchies. As I said in my Vivi video, this is why we're shown the contrast between Wapol and Vivi. There are no good or bad pirates. There are just pirates who sometimes do good things and pirates who sometimes do bad things. And by default, this means there are no good or bad Marines. But the Marines themselves are an ironic representation of what this good versus bad mindset can create, because suddenly you've created a system that holds a prejudice against specific groups of people with the idea of justice on your side. But I will save the Marine discussion for another time, and trust me, there will be another time. Sorry I went off track. But what I'm trying to say with all of this is, by all means, the Straw Hats could have become villains themselves. Nami easily could have turned into someone hate-filled and resentful with the abuse she received from Arlong, along with the loss of her mother. Chopper could have turned into a full-fledged monster with the rejection of both the reindeers and humans. Robin could have become the so-called devil she was labeled as. And Sanji could have turned into an emotionless, cruel person as he matured, even without the mutation. Many Straw Hats have faced extreme traumas. Traumas that very well could have led them down a dark path. But they didn't. And what's the difference here between them and villains such as Big Mom and Kaido? They had an external help. Older people that had their best interests in mind and worked to help these children find light in a dark place. Not so they could manipulate them, but so they could help them heal. Law is literally a perfect instance of how a villain is formed in this world, not by trauma, but by manipulation. He was prime villain origin story material. He was literally being groomed by Doflamingo to follow in his evil little footsteps and become Doflamingo's perfect loyal henchman, the obedient Corazon that Doflamingo never had. And how was Doflamingo doing this? By giving a traumatized, unloved child a home. I say home in air quotes because this shit was not a home. I will stand by what Doflamingo crafted was a cult more than it ever was a crew. But Doflamingo gave Law a sense of care, a sense of trust, and a sense of worth. He gave Law someone to look up to, someone to admire, and someone to idolize. Law was a broken child. Doflamingo full well knew Law was a broken child, and even liked the damage he saw in Law's eyes. When you are someone who has gone through traumatic events, a lot of the time you become vulnerable. It's in different ways, and Law is an example of one of these ways. Law was not only a kid, but an angry kid. So more than anything, Law would want both a home and someone who could understand him. He thought Doflamingo was exactly that, because Doflamingo made Law believe that's what he was. And Doflamingo offered promises. He was offering shiny things and kind words, such as the idea that if Law stuck with him, they might find something that could cure him and his illness. Even with all the red flags around Doflamingo, even with the extreme insincerity and violence in his words, how could Law not find some glimmer of hope at such an idea? Doflamingo, unmistakably, was that outside source Law was vulnerable to, and one Law thought was good for him, because Law's head wasn't telling him to heal, it was telling him to hurt, something Doflamingo only encouraged in the 2.5 years they knew each other. But Then Corazon comes along, a man who could also see Law hurting, albeit a bit later than the rest, and realize something so important about this kid. Law was looking to hurt because there was no one who cared about him, at least in any sincere way. There was simply no one who loved him, hence why Law breaks down crying as Corazon calls him a poor thing, because this is the first person to truly see Law's pain as something that needs healing, not something that needs exploiting. Something in Law was obviously triggered in this moment, something emotional and profound that he cried upon realizing how much he really is hurting. I can't speak for everyone, but have you ever had that moment where you go through life thinking something about yourself or something you've gone through like it's nothing, but then you speak about it to someone nonchalantly and they essentially console you, and it's at that moment you realize, oh my god, I've been hurting the whole time. And while I'm crying about it, a warmth has also started to embrace me. If you understand this feeling, I'm sure you get where I'm coming from, because that's exactly what this moment is. It's Law realizing he has this trauma, and actually finding the light he needed through Corazon. The external help has switched from Doflamingo to Corazon, and we see the radical difference between exploiting a person's trauma versus healing a person's trauma. Again, this is purposeful, and this is a key point in how Oda treats his characters when giving them trauma through big events. Because when you traumatize a character, it can be a double-edged sword. This can help the audience relate to the character, but at the same time, if you're making them a villain, there's a risk of totally mishandling it. Mostly since, if you streamline it, you can turn the message into, because this person has this trauma, they have become unlovable and or evil. That can be a bit insensitive at times. I understand it's not always that serious, it's just it can definitely come off that way when presenting such a topic without second guessing it. Hence why nearly every character who has a backstory and is shown with certain traumas, from villains to protagonists, it's always shown the trauma is not the problem. The trauma is not just what molds the person. It's who they meet and who extends their hand and the systems that be that leads them down different paths in life. Their trauma is simply something they must work through, not something that makes them. And sometimes these characters just don't receive the healing they so desperately needed. So the external force is what makes them into something they never thought they'd be. As I said in my chopper video, your trauma does not shape you into someone unlovable. An idea One Piece as a whole shouts from the heavens throughout hundreds upon hundreds of chapters. Now, we've talked about the formations of trauma and how One Piece handles it in carefully designed ways to show the outcomes are not the fault of the victim. But what about how this series presents healing, especially if it's of similar situations, and shows somewhat similar effects as a result of said trauma? Oda shows related traumas in different ways with different origins, and by doing so gives us different developments for how a person copes and how a person heals. An extremely good example of this is Usopp and Sanji. Let's take a closer look at them so you can get what I mean. On the surface, there is nothing in common about these two. Usopp had a cushy home island life, while Sanji had an abusive upbringing due to his blood family, and because of this, had to run away from his home. Usopp grew up in a stable place, while Sanji grew up in a sea-sailing restaurant, essentially getting a job at the ripe old age of 8 to 10 years old. The poor boy boy worked in customer service as a line cook for the good majority of his life. That's a personal hell I wouldn't want to wish on anybody. Because of these different lives and different experiences, Usopp has a softer temperament while Sanji has a more violent one. It's only natural considering Usopp didn't have to deal with angry customers every day while blocking out the trauma of his previous blood father. And yet both of these characters have a trauma that involves the worth of needing to be useful to varying degrees. Now, pause for a second, because here's the thing. I struggle to say Usopp did actually have a cushy life, and I would honestly say he probably didn't. The thing is, when you compare Usopp's origins to Sanji's origins, of course Usopp's is going to pale in comparison, because Sanji's tragic backstory is like comparing a baseball field to a backyard, or something. I know there's a baseball analogy there, I just forgot how it went. What I'm saying is, of course if you put these two side by side and look at their pasts, you're going to point at Sanji and say he had it the hardest. So why should we care about the other guy? But that's the idea. That's the reason for why so many characters have these big soap opera dramatics of a story, while others are just simple. Because trauma can form from anywhere, from anything, if the life event in question was distressing or devastating enough. After all, Usopp still watched his mother die in front of him at a young age. It was by semi-natural causes, considering she was taken by sickness, but imagine what that must do to a little boy's mental state. Imagine how that would rewire his brain, especially with his dad not being there and without any other immediate family to look after him. Sure, Usopp grew up on an island that was relatively peaceful, but would you really say a little boy had it easy when he lost his mother? Anyone who's lost a loving parent will tell you how soul-crushing that is. And anyone who's been through that would feel so deeply for Usopp upon watching him go through that. Instead of dealing with customers every day, Usopp deals with an angry mob every day. But he's calling out to them in the morning for a few reasons. He enjoys the attention he receives, and it's also to let the town know it's another peaceful morning in his own Usopp way. And of course, this lie he tells also comes from the fact he was calling for his dad as his mum was dying. So it's also Usopp's own way of keeping his mother with him while having hope that his seafaring pirate father would come back to pick him up and take him away on a magical journey. Kai's butler, Mary, even said with the lonely life Usopp lived, he had to create his own hope, even if it came in the form of a lie. Either way, we can totally see where Usopp's own trauma comes from, and why he has this depression in believing he's useless in certain ways. So Usopp's coping mechanism for this, for thinking of himself as useless, is quite literally lying. He lies that he's bigger than he is, stronger than he is, and tries to trick even himself into being the brave pirate warrior he wants to be. Is this the healthiest thing to do? You can argue it isn't, but sometimes the way to feel okay is to tell yourself you're okay. While what Usopp says are lies, they tend to be white lies, and they genuinely can help him see the positives of an otherwise dire situation. I'm not going to get into Sanji because I have to stop being predictable, but obviously Sanji has his own ways of coping through his own trauma. Once again, with certain similarities in losing his mother and essentially having no one to look after him. So when we look at these two side by side, we see where their trauma has formed from, and we understand why they both believe themselves to be useless in their own minds. They're not, of course, but it's what they think. Except we see their key differences when encountering Perona. As she uses negative holo on them, Sanji is affected while Usopp isn't. Usopp shouting his iconic line of how he's basically already depressed. And this is interesting, because by all means, Sanji is the one who is happy to die. Sanji does not value his own life. and only sees his life as something he can use to help others. Usopp, on the other hand, very much values life. He will run away from enemies with snot dripping down his nose so long as he doesn't die. Yet Perona's power affects Sanji instead of him. This is because Usopp believes his abilities to be useless, while Sanji believes his life to be useless. Sanji is very much proud of his own abilities. He knows he's a good cook, he knows he's a good fighter, and he knows he can stand toe-to-toe with enemies on the Grand Line. Usopp does not think this way. Usopp thinks he's lesser than the crew due to being unable to do anything against powerful opponents. And this negative mindset is why Perona doesn't work on him. Because what the hell can turn him negative when he thinks he has nothing to be proud about in this moment anyways? Honestly, I think we see two types of depression very well through Usopp and Sanji. Their themes are similar to the point it's been acknowledged, because it's no coincidence Sanji was the one boosting Usopp up throughout Water 7. It's just that one of them values life while the other thinks they're only good as a sacrificial lamb. And that's what Oda does very well when writing the trauma of these characters. He gives them themes that seem the same on the surface, but he takes it in two different directions. Because that's what trauma within a person does. It manifests differently in everyone. And One Piece is telling us there will never be the same reaction from the same feeling, because everyone will process their trauma differently. And the best part about Usopp and Sanji's parallels to me is that Sanji does not look down on Usopp for it. Sanji, by all means, can say he's been through harder times, but he doesn't. Instead, he understands Usopp and he supports Usopp. Because when someone goes through one thing and someone else goes through another, what the hell do you gain from comparing it? So what if Usopp's past wasn't as big as Sanji's? He's still damaged from it, and it's a damage Sanji knows all too well. This isn't the goddamn trauma Olympics. That's not how it works in One Piece, and it's not how it works in real life. Support is all that's needed for characters like Usopp and Sanji. And once again, that's the reason Sanji was the one who was always around trying to help Usopp throughout Water 7. And it's also why Sanji kicked Luffy for the shit he was about to say once the Merry was being given up on. Because Luffy just didn't understand the reasoning for Usopp's outburst and feelings. But Sanji did. If you want more of an insight on Sanji, Usopp, and even lore, I have videos for all of them. I think they're worth the watch after everything I've talked about in this video. I don't know, my goal is to just help everyone expand their minds a bit more, so I hope you're feeling the expansion. Honestly, another good example of similar traumas through different events is Zoro and Robin. Zoro's backstory is honestly pretty plain, while Robin's is tragedy on steroids. But the similarity these two hold is carrying on and holding a loved one's dreams. Zoro holds Kuina's dreams while Robin holds Ohara's dreams. And when you see these two characters, they are somewhat similar. Both of them tend to hold back their emotions. They tend to be distrustful, and they tend to wall themselves off. This has changed over time thanks to finding loving crewmates. But their stories are a great showing of what I've been talking about. We are comparing the loss of a whole island to the loss of one friend. Even though Robin's loss was technically bigger, Zoro still gained a fear and a lot of damage upon losing Kuina. Zoro's story, in my opinion, tells us your pain does not mean any less just because someone else had it worse. Because if we look at Zoro, what the hell do we see? We see a guy who's literally carrying his best friend's sword into his adulthood, and whose soul has been permanently injured, to the point he's holding on to Kuina's promise and dream with his own life. Once again, it's a showing of where trauma comes from, and and how it manifests itself through world-ending events or not. Because sometimes your world is one person, and their leaving can become your undoing. Okay, time to finish this video off because this was meant to be short. Whoops. Right, so I wanted to talk about more characters. Honestly, I just don't think I can, lest I risk boring you all to death. But for a silly show about pirates, it sure knows how to present damaged people. And once again, it knows how to present damaged people as their damage never being their fault. It presents their trauma being something that can shape them, but not who they are. How One Piece handled trauma within characters is something that stood out a lot to me, and it's because of the amount of ugly flaws we see. Nami is a violent diva, Sanji is an overdramatic flirt, Zoro is an angry, stubborn idiot, Usopp is a cowardly liar, and Luffy is, by all means, a selfish person. And yet, they all found a home amongst each other. Because trauma isn't pretty. It's not pleasing, and it can very well create flaws. There is no such thing as a perfect victim who pokes their fingers together and has a pretty little face with big sad eyes. Trauma is something unsightly, it's something damaging, and it's something that needs healing. This is why the flaws these characters have are all so important to me. Usopp's lying, Sanji's perverted chivalry, Zoro's childish stubbornness, and anything else you can think of with all the Straw Hats. It all means something, and it's all a look into how a person hurts. Even more than that, it's a look into how a person can heal. With understanding, with love, and with affection, we are watching these characters heal. I truly believe what we watch, what we read, what we consume in general can teach us empathy in certain ways. Yes, these characters are not real. What they go through isn't real, but they can still mirror our friends, our loved ones, or even ourselves. They can teach us what to look out for, and they can teach us how to help those we care about. As always, One Piece does not handle everything well. There are mistakes in many places, but I truly feel Oda treads carefully and lovingly when writing disturbing backstories, mainly due to the fact that pirates are about the broken and the damned. Pirates are about the social rejects, the misfits, and the damaged. So when Luffy forms his crew, his family, and tells them he loves them with all his heart, of course he means it. One Piece is a story about adventure, about fantasy and battles, but it's just as much about trauma and love as well. My favorite arcs in One Piece have always been the ones that heavily look into the themes of love, specifically how it can heal a person. And the recent Egghead arc is telling me Oda is only doubling down on these themes from here on out. I couldn't be happier about it. These characters may all be traumatized, but they're also so heavily loved as well. There's truly plenty we can learn from that. My favorite lesson being helping someone doesn't always mean taking down kingdoms or emperors. Sometimes it can just be a warm hug and a smile. And with that, thanks for watching. Sorry for getting a little gay there at the end, but what can I say? One Piece turns me mushy and pathetic. I want to be hugged by Luffy's big stretchy arms so bad. Let me know what you think. Is there any character you specifically relate to? Is there a character you just appreciate for existing? And is there a character or scene that has legitimately taught you something in an emotional sense? I have a whole list of things myself, but I want to hear it from you. Just a quick reminder that I do have a Patreon, and if you would like to support me there, I'd really appreciate it. However, I know not everyone can support me in that way, and watching and sharing these videos does more than you can imagine for me. My Patreon also includes how to get into my Discord, which I always forget to mention, but I do have a Discord, so there you go. If there's anything you'd like to see me cover, One Piece or otherwise, please let me know, and I'll see you in whatever I make next. See ya!